And so, as I said at the opening of the service, tomorrow is St. George's Day, and given certain patriotic sentiments that are naturally abroad in the nation at the present time, whether that be the events of the Duke of Edinburgh's passing, or whether it be the debates we've found ourselves in over Brexit and how we are handling the pandemic as a nation, I thought it would be interesting to explore the theme of St. George and our patron saint. Let's start by asking what we know about George himself. The answer is precious little. In fact, in the year 494, Pope Gelasius I stated that George was among those saints, and I quote, whose names are justly reverenced among men, but whose actions are known only to God. In other words, he really didn't know much about him at all. There were very little in the way of records of George's life or indeed his martyrdom. But there was no doubt that he was a real person and a real martyr. Further research tells me that for every story or legend about St. George, there are 2 or 3 others which tell quite a different story. But here is a reasonable summary of what we think that we know about him with a fair degree of certainty. George was probably a Syrian man who became a Roman soldier, and he was living in Palestine at the beginning of the 4th century. He was martyred at the town of Lod, which is southeast of Tel Aviv in Israel, in about the year 304. This was about the time of the persecutions of Diocletian, the same persecutions, incidentally, which ended the life of St. Faith of Aquitaine, our patron saint here. George became known throughout the East as the Great Martyr, quite quickly after his death. There were churches in England dedicated to him from as far back as the year 700 or thereabouts. There's a record of a dedication in Dorset to St. George in the year 700. The story of him slaying the dragon may be due to him being mistaken in iconography, religious paintings, for St. Michael, who is also usually depicted wearing armor. It may also be a mistaken identification with Perseus slaying a sea monster, a myth that's also associated, incidentally, with Lod, where George died. George is, of course, not only England's patron saint. He's also the patron of Ethiopia, a fact of which I love to remind white supremacists when they try to appropriate George to their warped cause. He's also the patron saint of Portugal and of the Mediterranean islands of Malta and Goza. George is the patron saint of the Orthodox Church, the whole Orthodox Church, and whose depictions of him in icons are legendary. The famous flag of St. George that flies on the top of our tower here, the red cross on a white background, also flying on our altar, our high altar here. Well, that flag was first conceived by the city-state of Genoa in Italy. It is, for me, an encouraging idea that England has chosen as its patron saint such a multicultural figure as St. George. The other major countries of the British Isles are perhaps a bit more parochial in their outlook. Andrew, chosen for Scotland, quite probably because Scotland was claimed to be the final resting place of that great apostle. So you can see a direct connection between Andrew and Scotland. Patrick, well, he was a Briton, possibly grew up somewhere around Chelmsford, but he did a fantastic job of then converting the Irish to Christianity. But he was one of us. He was a native born. David, of course, was a Welshman, indeed the Bishop of Wales. But England? Well, we used to have a patron saint who was a native of Britain, namely Edward the Confessor, who was the last king of Wessex, who died, as I'm sure you all know, in 1066, just before those momentous events. St. Thomas of Canterbury was another prime candidate as a patron saint for a while, but they were all replaced ultimately by George, the warrior saint, who was venerated all around the world, a truly international symbol. It was, in fact, only during the reign of Edward VI in 1554 that George ascended fully to the status of England's official and only patron saint. Another delicious irony of St. George is the extent to which he's venerated by Muslims. George features quite large in ancient Islamic texts, and he is still the subject of many prayers among Muslim people. There's a lovely story of when William Dalrymple visited the shrine of St. George at Beit Jala in the West Bank in 1995. He asked the priest at the shrine, "Do you get many Muslims coming here?" And the priest replied, "We get hundreds, almost as many as the Christian pilgrims. Often when I come in here, I find Muslims all over the floor, up the aisles, up and down." So, let's review what we know. George was a Syrian, a Roman soldier who died in Israel. He's venerated by both Christians and Muslims, by the Orthodox Church, by an African nation, Ethiopia. He's venerated across the Middle East and by other major European powers like Portugal. So when people wonder why I am content to proudly fly the cross of St. George from the tower of this church building, I tell them this. I say, to appropriate George as some kind of narrow English nationalist is a remarkably ignorant thing to do. It's a laughable example of an own goal. George represents one of the most multicultural saints that I can think of. He's loved and venerated across the world, from Russia to Africa, all across Europe and the Middle East, and thanks to the Portuguese, across much of South America too. He's a symbol of universal brotherhood and the battle against the dragons of our weaker human nature, which seek to corral us into tribes locked in hatred, fear, and suspicion of one another. And let's remember, finally, something important about all the saints, to whose example we, of course, look. No one ever became a saint for looking out for number one. No one ever became a saint by putting up borders and failing to offer aid. No one ever became a saint by hoarding their personal wealth and failing to feed the hungry. St. George stands as an exemplar of sainthood, someone whose story embraces all humanity and whose life was poured out in sacrifice. May we all have the courage to follow such an example as St. George. Amen.